Hello and welcome to this discussion. I am Katerina Soku. I am the Washington DC correspondent for Kathimerini and Sky TV and a visiting fellow at the Atlantic Council at the Future Europe Initiative. I am especially happy to be moderating this discussion on the global ramifications of the US elections. We have with us two of the distinguished professors at the University of Piraeus, Athanasios Platias, who is a professor of strategy and director of the graduate program in International and European Studies, and Professor Aristotle Ziabiris, who is also the president of the newly founded Council for International Relations, bringing together more than 60 foreign policy and international economy professors. Full disclosure, he is also my PhD supervisor. And as you students know there, if your supervisor asks you to moderate, you deliver. And of course, we are honored to be joined by my distinguished colleague, journalist Marcos Kounalakis. Marcos is an author and a scholar, a foreign affairs analyst, a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution, as well as an awarded columnist. His syndicated weekly foreign affairs column has been praised for not only offering strong prose and strong opinions, but also offering an education. So we are especially grateful for his time today and looking forward to hear what he has, his insight on the US elections and its ramification that it might have on foreign policy throughout the world. And of course, I should mention, last but not least, he is also the second gentleman of California after his wife, Eleni Kounalakis, was elected lieutenant governor in 2018. And if I may use my moderator's privilege to kickstart the discussion, Marco, how extraordinary do you think is this election, and in what ways?
Well, first of all, thank you. Good morning from California. Good afternoon to you in Greece, and anyone else who's watching around the world. Welcome, and I'm so happy to be participating in this extraordinary and wonderful discussion that you've invited me to participate in. I want to thank Professor Ziambris and, of course, Professor Platias, and it's great. I've never lectured at the University of Piraeus, and so this is also a privilege, and I'm looking forward to it. If you look behind me, you will see that I have a typical California backdrop. That's not a Zoom backdrop. That actually is California. It is morning here, and I am in Palm Springs, California. So a little bit of a scene setter. The weather is quite nice, even though it is October. And I am socially distanced from everyone, including my family. So, Katerina, thank you so much for the invitation and for bringing me along. This is an extraordinary. You were asking how extraordinary this election is. It is extraordinary. It is extraordinary in so many ways, not just because of the character of the President of the United States and the transformative nature of what it is he's done during the last 4 years in the White House. But it's extraordinary in that for the first time really in certainly in modern history, but I venture to say through US history, it's a contested election even before the election's been held. And so as we approach November 3rd and the election day, even though this is really an election period because the election has already begun, we've already submitted in the United States millions, tens of millions of votes. We can arrive on November 3rd at one of three outcomes, and I can talk about that a bit, or if you like, we can make this interactive to begin with and just start taking questions. However you wanted to do this. But I have, I would talk about my three outcome potential and what those would look like.
Please do. Let's start with that so that we
Yeah.
set the scene.
Right, and it's not going to be a lecture. I'm basically just going to say, essentially there are three outcomes, right? One is, two of them are obvious, and the third one is the one I just discussed. So one is, of course, Donald J. Trump convinces the United States or rigs the election well enough to be able to serve a second term. And by rigging, I mean, with voter suppression and various other means, whether it's shutting down the United States Postal Service in key states or disqualifying a number of the votes have come in through the mail system or who that have been submitted with a contestation against those qualifications of the voters themselves. So that's the first potential outcome. The second also something from is not in the world, but certainly not in the United States. He, along with newcomer for many, um, becomes the president and vice president. Is my connection working okay? Oops,
We're hoping for it to get
was I
better.
frozen here?
Yes.
Am I okay?
Yes.
Okay, I know that my okay. So I don't know if that got cut off, but the second outcome is, of course, Biden-Harris, and that would work quite well. You know what? It might help. Okay, everybody else is on mute. If everyone else maybe mutes, with the exception of me and whoever else it is, that might help as well. Okay. And then, of course, the third outcome is the one that we discussed at the very front end, which is we have a contested, not just election, but a contested period post-election, November 3rd, all the way up to, and perhaps even, who knows, beyond the January 20th inauguration date. So those are the three outcomes. I'm not going to expand too much on Donald J. Trump. The world has experienced him for the last 4 years, but I can and will talk a bit about his potential foreign policies and global outlook during a lame duck presidency. So, what does 4 years of Donald Trump look like again in the next 4 years? Secondarily, what does a Biden-Harris foreign policy look like, and um, you know, how do we anticipate that, and what do we look for that is different? And then finally, what happens in a contested period? So I'm not going to talk about Trump yet. As much as we can talk about him as much as you want, but there are certain unique qualities, whether it be again as a lame duck or policies towards Iran, what happens with China tensions, how does the relationship with NATO evolve, what happens with the promotion of democratic and human rights values around the world. But let me focus really quickly on a Biden-Harris administration and what that looks like. And I think if there's anything you're going to take away, there are two really distinct qualities that will come to a Biden-Harris administration that are different, distinctly different from what a Donald J. Trump second administration would look like. And they're very simple. The one is the difference between a bilateral versus a multilateral approach, and the second is the promotion of a values-based foreign policy versus a non-values-based foreign policy. So, as I say, two really distinct likely outcomes with this change. As you've seen during the last 4 years, President Trump prefers bilateral relations. He seems to abhor multilateral institutions, treaties, agreements, because he feels that he has more leverage in bilateral relationships where the power of the United States, whether it be the military or material power of the United States, can be leveraged in a quite effective way when he's dealing strictly on a one-on-one basis with another nation versus, say, a European community or other sorts of alliance-based groups. He feels much stronger negotiating with South Korea or Japan versus an ASEAN type of organization. That's not true for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris in that administration. They are going to seek to reaffirm those multilateral agreements and multilateral relationships that have predated the Trump administration, and to rebuild them in ways that I think will strengthen them. I think that Joe Biden is inclined to try to work with other nations, feeling viscerally and going it alone. All right, so that's look for more multilateralism versus bilateralism that exists in Trump. The second is the values-based orientation. And here, right out the gate, when the Trump administration came to power, they made it very clear, and with Secretary Tillerson, human rights not on the agenda for the United States in any pursuit of foreign policy going forward. And is this devaluation of values, except for in instances where they can be leveraged for advantage in a relationship. So, if there is any area where the Trump administration uses um, uh, human rights, for example, to talk about the United States policy, it's in the case of Xinjiang in China to basically beat up an adversary. Uh, Same types of issues are that he won't use them, for example, in Russia. All right. Um, I see that maybe my connection is causing some trouble. Katerina, is it okay? Let me stop there, and I won't talk about contested at this point because let's just make sure that everything's functioning.
Okay, great. And if I may suggest, if you have any windows open in the background, it would help if you close them. But let me take this opportunity to turn to our professors for any initial reaction or thought that your introduction brought to them, maybe about the values versus non-values aspect of the relationship. Professor Platias?
Katerina, let me try to provoke Marco. Let me play the devil's advocate, to make some debate.
Yes.
You mentioned that the line between Biden and Trump is multilateralism and bilateralism. I will argue that it's multilateralism versus unilateralism. As a matter of fact, that's what he promised, American first. So I perceive his foreign policy based on unilateralism. Now, from this part of the world, when we evaluate Trump's foreign policy, we may say all kinds of things. He has been an unmitigated disaster. He destroyed the U.S. alliance. He destroyed the U.S. post-World War II international order, rise of anti-Americanism, and all these kind of arguments. But looking from a democratic perspective and looking from his perspective, I think he delivered what he promised. He got elected on a certain agenda, and the people that sent him to the White House, they sent him because they wanted to be tough on trade, and he was tough on trade. He wanted to abstain from foreign conflicts, to withdraw troops, and he has abstained. And he has reduced the US troops abroad. Or he has promised to withdraw from, as he called it, disastrous unilateral treaties. So he revoked the nuclear deal with Iran. He withdrew from the Paris Climate Accord. Or he said that he will be tough in international organizations. Or he withdrew from the World Health Organization. He promised that he'd be closing orders. He did that with Mexico, and he used the pandemics to make it difficult to come to the United States. So, from his perspective, he delivered to his voters what he promised, which is actually quite democratic. So, there are two different standards in judging him. We judge it in a way that we would have liked him to behave. But I think it's fair to judge him according on his promises. What do you think, Marco?
So thank you, and I think that is a provocative and I think an accurate assessment of much of what he says. But I will um, vary a bit from your analysis. So on the unilateral front, I think that we often think about the unilateralist approaches towards imposition of a policy on others, and as the saying goes, it takes two to tango. When you think about unilateralism in the United States and in its recent history, you think about the Iraq adventure, for example, where it really was a unilateral approach towards the engagement and really in contravention of both agreements and of alliance policy to go on in to Iraq. Um, as you pointed out, he was opposed to certain military approaches to certain actions, and indeed that has been the case. So there has been this ability to minimize on the military approach and our forward leaning approach on engagement, on military engagement overseas. But unilateralism doesn't really work in other areas. Trade, by its definition, requires a trading partner or someone with whom you're trading. So there needs to be some level of, in this case, bilateralism. While he's worked against the WTO and other multilateral institutions, he's done so to the detriment of the United States and really isolating the United States rather than trying to build something better. So while the president's campaign promises were indeed to rip up, as he said, many of these agreements, whether it was NAFTA, which was the North American Free Trade Agreement, or the JCPOA, which was the agreement with Iran, a nuclear deal that was done with 5 other nations. He wasn't promising that he was going to rip them up and throw them away because they were inferior. He was promising better deals. So it wasn't an entire isolationist approach or unilateralist approach that he was promising. He was promising a better approach towards agreements in the international field through bilateralism, as he, I think, prefers, versus these unwieldy organizations that the United States has diluted control over. So that's the first part of the bilateral versus unilateral versus multilateral. On the second part, which is, this has been a democratic revolution in many ways, if you want to frame it that way, because he really has done, again, something he promised in his campaign, which was disrupt entirely the mechanisms and the institutional structures of the United States. And there are many who are in the electorate, and we will see what happens on November 3rd. There may be a majority who still believe that this is the only way to reform, the oldest democracy in the world. That, in fact, these institutions that were started in the 18th century and were written about back then and constitutionalized have, sort of run their course. We're in late stage capitalism. The democracy that we've been evolving has come to a late stage as well, and that it's time for somebody to just blow things up. And that a vote for Donald Trump is basically a middle finger to the career political class based in Washington, D.C. I think there's a very strong movement of those within the United States who still feel very strongly that despite their own material interest, it's worth pulling the lever and telling the rest of the country that they're tired of business as usual, and that he should continue to disrupt and destroy these institutional structures in favor of whatever it is that he feels for. So, and the final point I would make is that while he's been successful at taking and dismantling these institutional structures, these agreements, he has not been successful at rebuilding them, with perhaps the exception of the Supreme Court and the justice system in general, where he has, in fact, been able to, with the alliance of a Republican Senate, reform it into something that reflects his person.
If I may jump in to also bring Professor Tsiabidis into the discussion, and I have to say your analysis, Marco, is more sophisticated than President Trump would put it. I've seen a lot of attacks on the swamp of Washington, but not necessarily any argument coherent and comprehensive about the need to reform American democracy and him being a vessel in that direction. But Ari, you've also studied American history, and what's your take on this?
Well, first of all, before I give you my take, let me just throw out two things that I absolutely have to say. First of all, thank you, Katerina Soko, for doing this. And we have several hundred students watching on YouTube and about 100 on Zoom. And you're very wise. You don't say no to your supervisor. So let that be cast in stone. The second thing I'd like to say before I jump into this discussion is that I've been actually reading Michael Kounalakis' column for quite some time now. He's very generous posting it on Facebook. And I have to say about his columns that they're actually thoughtful, they're well argued, they're well informed. And what makes me particularly envious is that he always comes up with zingers, one liners, twists of phrase that make the narrative propel forward and also make it fun to read. And you do that with, I don't know, 800 words. That's quite an achievement. I mean, professors can do it. We can talk for an hour, or two, or three, or four, but do it succinctly. There's a lot of value. So we are very happy to have you here today. So yes, I've been following United States politics for quite some time now. And here's a little thing that I want to bring out. The world is watching. Why is the world paying so much attention? Why are we having this webinar tonight? Because what the United States does or does not do worldwide, globally, has ramifications. We'll be talking about this. Just think of the past of the invasion of Iraq or North Korea or Turkey. What the US does, Syria, Libya, or does not do affects the world. So we pay close attention to who wins the election and Congress in the United States. On the other hand, you watch the first debate, if we can call it a debate, there was zero discussion of foreign policy. And my question is, the world is watching, but in a time of pandemic and social unrest and economic recession, are the United States people paying attention to foreign policy? And what kind of legitimacy problems might this produce this time around?
So thank you, first of all, for your kind words. And now I'm under pressure to deliver some zingers and some short analyses. But look, to answer your question as succinctly as I can, no. The American people are not paying attention to foreign policy. This is not, and by the way, not uniquely at this moment. I mean, we've never really here in the United States paid attention to foreign policy as a decider of our politics. I would say foreign policy matters only insofar as if you don't understand foreign policy, you could lose an election. But how much you understand or engage in the foreign policy debate for an election really does not make much of a difference. The exception this cycle is that the global pandemic is global, and so and it is the issue. It is the issue all polls show is the most concerning for the American people right now, as it should be, because it affects everything. And despite the president's attempts to make it appear that it has a national solution, that there is national success, that this administration has moved to create miracle drugs and the like, it's fairly clear when he at the same time argues that it is the China virus or the Kung flu or however he prefers to refer to it and to attach blame on Beijing, that it does remain a global issue. So yes, that is the one foreign affairs global issue, and I think it may be determinative in this election. I think as long as the focus is on the COVID-19 crisis, the president may go down because of not just some of the early incompetence that existed in the administration, but also because he was caught in a lie on tape about the severity of the crisis, and then finally, by not being able to collaborate on a global basis on a global issue, has been, I think, also just detrimental to the health and well-being and economics of the United States.
Okay, this is actually very helpful. Katarina, I'll pass it on to you now.
Yes, thank you, Ari. I'll just I would like to before we go into the specifics for foreign policy topics and how they might be impacted. You mentioned earlier the lame duck period of a Trump presidency as we're waiting for a new administration. And in our region, this is particularly important, of the world, this is particularly important given tensions with Turkey. At the same time, I'm watching Secretary Pompeo's activities around the world, and he's been very active in engaging around the world. He's currently in Asia. How do you see this period playing out? And is it even more unstable than what we have come to associate with the lame duck period traditionally in American politics?
So two separate segments, two separate periods that there's actually three: the pre-election, the election period between election and the new administration, and then January 20th on. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the term lame duck, that essentially is a term that applies to politicians who have no more elections going forward, so that the period that they're in and during which they're governing has less leverage over the other institutional governing structures. So you can't really, other than through the power of your example or the power of your campaigning, really have much effect on the Congress or on the Senate. So I broke them up into three periods, right? Right now, the electoral period as we go towards November 3rd. And so let me start with that period. Part of the reason that Pompeo is doing what he's doing is because there are certain groups within the United States that do pay close attention to foreign policy. And those are groups like Greek Americans, Armenian Americans, who are really concerned about this administration and whether or not they can feel justified in voting for Donald Trump despite some of the other aspects, because they're oftentimes single issue voters. The Armenian Americans, for example, are very much an example of this. Very powerful group, very small group, but nonetheless are quite mobilized and quite significant. And really, anyone who's in American politics should respect them, not only because of their organizational abilities, but also because of their tenacity and their history. In this case, they happen to be on the right side as well. And so the attempt, therefore, to try to at least come up with an interim solution before the election between the Azeris and the Armenians to at least have a sop to that community, even if it's not a complete solution or an ongoing sustainable solution to the regional problems. In terms of Asia, well, there's clear strategic interests that are ongoing, but it's also an important aspect of the argument that the president has been making for his continuation in office, that he can remain tough on China, that he can try to put together, whether it be a containment approach or some other type of approach towards Beijing, that he can at least make the effort to get out into these areas and at least bridge some of those difficulties, especially as we're looking at a leadership change in Japan, at some really tough talk to South Korea, we're early flubs with the Australian government, and finally, the real recognition that we will need to have a tighter understanding and alignment with India as the Indo-Pacific region becomes much more key going forward. So those things are just partly matter of course, partly political. In a contested environment, that means we get to November 3rd, but we don't have a clear election result. An outcome is still pending, either because there are legal challenges or because Donald Trump refuses to accept the outcome, or any number of potential challenges to this election. We have a really dangerous environment because the rest of the world will observe the turmoil within the United States, the division within the United States, the inability to feel that there's legitimacy either in the presidency, that with the sitting president, or with an outgoing Senate, uh, and that will provide a lot of opportunity for shenanigans for those who feel either because Trump is on his way out that this is the time to move before a tougher Joe Biden or a Joe Biden who can bring to bear an alliance movement against an adversary. That this might be the very moment that Turkey and Erdogan, for example, might flex their muscles even more aggressively than they have in the recent past in this period during the election when they feel, again, America is distracted. And we can go on region to region to talk about what those potential flashpoints might be. Taiwan, for example, in Southeast Asia. And then, of course, there is what happens immediately afterwards, and we can talk about that as well. What happens in a Biden administration versus what happens in a Trump administration when Trump is a lame duck? Does he even care about foreign policy beyond what it means for him personally? I mean, there are those who argue that many of his foreign policy interests are driven by his own material interests, whether they be as a hotelier or because of these banking loans that he has, that there may be leverage on him. That's something that's not being talked about as much as it was a few weeks ago, but the reality still remains there. Can he get anything past a Senate that needs to ratify treaties, for example? Will he be able, especially if the Senate flips to become a Democratic Senate and a Democratic Congress? Or does he rely again on strict executive orders? And finally, does he, in a lame duck environment, decide that all those things that he's been rather restrained about when it comes to military power are suddenly just a hallmark of the first administration, but that when he is in fact pushed or shoved, that he decides to respond in a way that was not typical of the first administration, which showed not only restraint but also withdrawal, as Professor Platias pointed out rightly. Whether it was a reasoned withdrawal from or not, and we can look to Syria and Afghanistan to debate whether those were reasoned withdrawals. What happens when the power of the presidency is waning on the legislative side, on the political side, but the power of the presidency remains fairly high and exercisable from the White House and from the Oval Office on the international field when it comes to deployments, and perhaps even worse. So those are the kinds of things that could happen depending on the personality, health, and well-being of the president and the structures that support or confront him.
Professor Platias, can you please follow up? I'm tempted to ask you a question, but I'll ask you to ask our guest rather.
Well, it's really fascinating. Apparently, we are entering in uncharted waters. And I think we will all agree that the title of our seminar today about the global ramifications has nothing to do with the persons that are voting, because the persons that are voting about how Trump has performed on the economy, how Trump has performed on healthcare, and how Trump has performed on health issues like Obamacare. So here is a contradiction. I mean, I agree with Aris and what Marco said, that there are global ramifications, but not in the mind on the ones that are casting the votes, because they are casting the votes on a completely different set of issues. Now, I was really intrigued, like you, Katerina, on the theoretical justification that Marco gave on the democratic disruption that Trump brought to Washington. That was a fascinating point. And I would like to extend that disruption in the international system. After World War II, the order that the US built was based on international institutions, based on economic interdependence that brought wealth not only to the United States, but mostly to the United States, and the democracies, because democracies bring peace, and it's better to have democratic governments than authoritarians. So we had a system that actually worked very well, and worked very well from the interest of the United States, because it became the sole superpower at a certain point, and with huge influence in the international system. The 5% or 4% of the world population controls almost 22% of the world economy and more than 50% of the world military expenditure. So the United States has performed well. So why, since the country performed so well in this system that it builds, it destroyed it? Does it make any sense?
So let me answer the first part, and then I'll come to the second part. You know, you're right. Americans are not voting on their foreign policy. And in fact, I could argue that they never really have. The argument might be made that during the Vietnam era, we voted to end the Vietnam War, and that's part of the reason why Richard Nixon, with peace at hand, won his reelection, for instance. When George W. Bush came into power, he was promising a humble foreign policy. Of course, he delivered something very different, the opposite. It was hubris, not humility, that he delivered. And so, you arrive at, so on the one hand, it's unclear whether or not we don't vote on foreign policy. And on the other hand, any president really enters into a reactive mode. There is really very little that you bring to the Oval Office other than an orientation, a set of values, and a belief system that you then ideally try to apply from the Oval Office, recognizing that much of your day is going to be dealt with in the global sense with reacting to the events and whatever it is that lands on your daily presidential brief in your PDB on your desk, because that's just the nature of the beast. So you don't vote on it, but you got to deal with it once you get into office. And ideally, you want to find somebody who you trust, who you think has the competence and the ability to deal with foreign policy. So given that, you then ask the question of why, in essence, has this administration blown up the very system that has been the basis of our power? And I'd say, here we have to enter a little bit into the psychology of Donald Trump as well, and really his orientation. Maybe not so much the psychology, but maybe his experience rather than how he sort of functions, in terms of his persona. And I'd say there's well, let me break this down. I'd say there's two things, right? One is he recognizes, as do many Americans, because we feel it, that particular structure that has been so profitable for the United States over in the post-war period it's been in relative decline. It's been in relative decline because of our adventure in the Middle East, in Iraq and in Afghanistan, although Afghanistan was more justifiable. We've been there for 20 years. It's been an enormous bleeding of treasure and of blood, where every American, I think, at this point recognizes the folly of that particular engagement, and without having a clear mission or a clear exit strategy when we approached it. So that has affected us. And during that period, of course, when we're talking about relative power, the loss of relative power, not only has it been a potentially $5 to $6 trillion cost suck, just from a material basis, not to mention the troops that we've lost on the ground. which is just beyond tragic and unnecessary. And not to mention, finally, the civilian loss of life that has occurred in these countries. But during this period, with this distraction and with this expense and with this focus on an unclear mission in a region far, far away, there's been another power that has been rising lockstep as we've been declining and spending away, and that, of course, is China. So here enters Donald Trump at the end, not at the end of our adventures in the Middle East, but certainly, what he wants to create, which is the end of these adventures. Withdrawal at any cost, in essence, whether it be from Syria or Afghanistan or Iraq, but withdrawal and perhaps handing over the regional responsibility to some of the regional players with whom he feels most comfortable and closest to. And this extraordinary and remarkable rise made possible by the United States and other economically developed nations in China. And so he feels that, and has argued that this system no longer has been working for the United States. In fact, the United States has been working to dismantle this system through its economic, military, and trade policies. And so from his perspective and that of those who vote for him, we are, in fact, it is required it is necessary to disrupt this system, because those few advantages that the United States still has from Donald Trump's perspective need to be asserted. That the dollar is still the dominant currency within the world, that the United States is still the innovation factory within the world, that we are still the center of educational excellence and export, so that those things, in Greek we would say charismata, that we have in the United States, need to be our points of leverage that we can maintain and stop to feed our adversary, in this case China, with all of those tools that they've been not only leveraging, but appropriating both fairly and unfairly, and changing the rules of this game that has worked so well in the post-war period and up until, I'd say, the beginning of the 21st century.
Katarina, if I may jump in here, and obviously the temptation to talk China is too big, but I'm actually going to leave that to Professor Platias, who's also translated and written a commentary on Sun Tzu in Greek, so he's more of an expert. But let me start by the following thing. There's an observation. On the one hand, who works in the Oval Office does make a difference. In my mind, had Al Gore been elected, Iraq would not have been invaded. And had Hillary been elected, there would have been no visit in North Korea. So it does matter. It does make a difference. It's also true that during an election period, parties and candidates tend and opt to emphasize their differences. That makes sense. On the other hand, in any sophisticated, developed Western democracy, there's also substantial continuity. There's continuity because interests do not change just because there's a new occupant in the White House, because there are constituencies, specific constituencies, because geography remains the same, because the bureaucracy has continuity. So let me, I'm getting to China for Professor Platias, that's the opening, but let me do the Greek thing and turn our attention a little bit to Greece. So we, in the past few years, there's no doubt that relations between Greece and the United States have improved. And from a Greek perspective, that has gone through several administrations, ideologies, and personalities.
Yeah.
So during the Trump years, relations have improved. And now, to use your scenario, we have the possibility that Biden gets elected. He has been to Greece in an official capacity more than once. He actually knows Greek issues, and Greek people and Greek Americans, as does Kamala Harris, I'm sure, in California. And in addition to that, I was looking, for whatever it's worth, at the campaign statements, position papers, or policy papers put out by the Biden campaign. It is very pro-Greek. So just to take maybe a little bit of the anxiety off, or maybe not, from a Greek perspective, is it safe to say that you predict more continuity and improved bilateral relations? Or do you foresee some problems, especially if we go to into the third scenario, a protracted, disputed election?
So first of all, thank you for bringing in the great men theory. It does matter who is in the office, in the Oval Office matters greatly. And your examples are perfect for showing that. And why what they bring to the office matters, because how they will react to any particular scenario is really the only thing you can sort of vote on if you are if you're focused on these types of issues. You are right. And so I should disclose at this point that, we are close personal friends with Kamala Harris. Eleni, my wife, was very helpful for her. We've known her for 20 years. And we've been very helpful at every stage of her political career. But we consider her also, more than that, a personal friend. And I even was on her team early on, helping with some of on her foreign policy advisory team, because we were supporting her during her presidential run. So I have a little bit of insight into her orientation and her background on these issues. But to Greece, so you're right. There has been this improvement, and in part, it's been between administrations, whether it be the Tsipras administration or the Mitsotakis administration in Greece. There's been a growing relationship, in particular at the moment when Grexit was off the table. I think that it became very clear. But I would say that Joe Biden also had a fair amount to do. And engaged personally to really make sure that Grexit was not going to occur. So we actually have data points when it comes to how Joe Biden would react and deal with Greece. He was very, very active prior to that during the early stages of the Tsipras administration. I would expect not only a continuation in a Biden administration of improvement with with Greece and with the Mitsotakis administration. And I should also say that Prime Minister Mitsotakis is a personal friend. My dad and his dad fought together in the Nazi resistance on Crete. And so I've known the family for many years personally, and have great respect for what he's doing these days, and the incredible management of the crises that are befalling, economic, pandemic, you name it, doing it with great alacrity, competence, and aplomb. So not only do I see Biden continuing that relationship, he's been to Greece, he's been to the Fener in Istanbul, he's spoken out against some of the policies that Erdogan has tried to impose. I see a building of both that bilateral relationship even further from a guy who sometimes calls himself Joe Bidenopoulos with Greek Americans, but also a strengthening within the alliances that will also keep Turkey in check and strengthen Greece's frontline role in the Eastern Mediterranean, whether it be the issues of the border, economic issues, and any number of other regional issues regarding energy policy and the like. So Biden's orientation towards NATO and the European community are also going to likely help strengthen not just the bilateral relationship, but all the institutional structures that will help Greece, and from Turkey's perspective, be critical of and be a check on Ankara.
let me follow up as the journalist of the fellow journalist of the group here. I would like to go on theory, but no. I mean, while we're in the middle of the discussion in Greece about Greece, I'm just wondering. The Trump administration, in particular, has supported, or rather, I should say, the State Department has supported some of the trilateral partnerships in the wider region of the Eastern Mediterranean that has brought Greece closer to Israel, Cyprus closer to Israel, together Egypt as well. And that's on energy, but it's also on security. And I'm wondering, I guess this, do you think this is something that was driven by the national security strategy of 2018 that realized the trouble in the region with the Turkey that is becoming less predictable? Back then it was 2 years earlier, right? It wasn't as hard as it is today, but still it was showing the signs. And would that continue, you think, with the Biden administration? And would he be, do you think Biden administration would be harder on Turkey, or on probably on human rights issues, right? But also on the realpolitik of whether to impose sanctions on a NATO ally, for example?
Right. So, when we earlier discussed how much of a role foreign policy plays in United States domestic policy, I should always say that there is one exception, and it's not just the Armenian Americans and it's the Greek Americans. It's those, many of us, who believe that that the relationship with Israel is one of the strongest that the United States has, and it's a relationship that is key in the Middle East, and one that is always going to be supported regardless of party and regardless of events within the region. That is an unbreakable bond for the United States. And so, yes, on the one hand, there is a security aspect to it, not so much from the NSS of 2018, but yes, regional security in part. Yes, in part, energy, especially with the newfound reserves that are in the Eastern Mediterranean, the ability to deliver them. Yes, in part because of the more aggressive stance that Turkey is taking, whether it be in Syria or Libya or in now in the Azeri Armenian crisis, and also because of some of the relationships and breaks that they've had with Israel. But if I were to sort of highlight one particular domestic reason for this, it is that Florida is in play, and that Florida has a very large part of our electorate that focuses on the relationship with Israel, the security of Israel, and and even with at times the administrations within Israel, and making sure that they remain secure, stable, and reliable, and that the United States remains reliable. So, to the extent, and in particular, this president has recognized this and has tried to leverage this political reality within our country, almost hyperbolically, and he's had someone within his family, someone who he trusts, to be able to deploy to try to effectuate some of those policies. And of course, I'm speaking of Jared Kushner here, who, even predating the entry into the White House, had a personal relationship with Benjamin Netanyahu, who, predating the White House entry, had a relationship with Mohammed bin Salman. So there is a ability to marry the domestic political interests with our very positive regional developments. I mean, there's no one who, I think, can deny that what's happened with the UAE and with Bahrain and now with Sudan, recognizing Israel, and with the tightening of those relationships that you identified, Katerina, both with Greece and with Cyprus. It's been nothing but a positive story, while the rest of the Middle East is really undergoing some dramatic and serious realignments. And of course, whether it be the harbor blowing up in Beirut, or the withdrawal of American security forces in northeastern Syria, you've got a lot of movement and a lot of realignment with some of the ongoing challenges that remain in the region. So strengthening those relationships with Israel and with other, responsible players in the region is nothing but a positive.
Katerina, may I jump in? Hello?
Yes.
Yes, sorry,
Okay.
it takes me some time to unmute, but yes, please do.
Well, I agree absolutely with the policy analysis of Marcos has made. But now I will try to bring a schizophrenia to Marco, because Marco is a journalist, but also he has a PhD in international relations. And it's really strange to hear Marco and Aristoteles, international relations scholar, bring the great man theory and the impact in international affairs. Usually you are structuralist. We talk about the structures. So let me try to make a structural argument just to provoke Marco and Aristotle. Let's take the relations with China, or let's take broader international relations theory. They argue that based on your position in the international system, your power and your interest, you behave regardless of your domestic system and regardless of leadership. And if domestic reasons are in play, they are usually your domestic system, but not how your leader wakes up. So, and this has an old tradition. Let's take Thucydides. A lot of his contemporaries thought that Pericles was responsible for the Peloponnesian War. Thucydides came with a different theory that now it's popular as a Thucydides trap, that when there is a rising power, the dominant power feels threatened and it reacts. Now, if we apply the Thucydides model to the current US-China relations, we see that this is a structural imperative. In other words, China is rising for the reasons that Marco explained, relative power is shifting. The US feels threatened and it responds. But by the way, it's not only Trump that he responds. The pivot to China started with Obama. Yes. Trump actually exacerbated this trend. So on the important issues, and forget about style, the Obama and Trump style may be different. Rhetoric is different. But really, on the strategic level, do you think that personalities play so much difference, or the more structural reasons like balance of power, shift of balance of power, and the rising of China, and the US response would have been the same regardless of the personality of the president?
So it's a very good question, and thank you for calling on my scholarly understanding of both theory and its application in contemporary politics and international affairs. So to answer it simply, I would say both. I'd say that the structural aspects of policy that are determinative, whether it be rising power theory that leads to essentially a Thucydides trap in essence, and having to arrive at a point of whether you decide to contest or allow the rising power to overtake. Are
Marco,
all
could you
We're
please
right
repeat
to say
that?
there's
I
been
think we lost the
consistency
connection
in terms
here.
Yes, very good. My phone went off, and I think that's part of the reason. I was going to say that it's both. That in fact, can you hear me now? Yeah. So that it's both. That I think that you have essentially structural elements, but that great men play a role. And by great, I'm really just referring to the theory, not the personalities. And you're right to identify that the policies approaching China, a rising China, have been consistent, and maybe just accelerated and taking on a different form and a different tone from Obama to Trump. But what happens is, and where I think great men theory maybe doesn't overtake, but allows for a lot more latitude and a variance from sort of the structural definitions of how do we look at international relations and the relationships between states, is during moments of crisis. And those crises don't have a playbook. And so what happens with great men in where people, where the leadership matters, is that you can leverage those crises to change the structure, the domestic structure, and even the international relationships within powers. And let me use a few examples in particular with the countries we mentioned, China and the United States, because these crises don't need to be recognized or crises as we understand them. They could be manufactured crises. And we've seen manufactured crises over time in various countries where you're able to create the conditions for a martial law within a nation or any number of other things that allow you then to change the structural relationships within your domestic power, regardless of the polity that brought you into power. So in China, one of the things that I think was instructive for Xi Jinping, who came into power in 2012, was the 2008 financial crisis, global financial crisis, and the understanding that suddenly the great and powerful Oz, also known as the United States of America, was suddenly not in charge of this well-oiled economic machine that was dictating how, in fact, trade and finance should occur within the United States. He saw a weakness that existed within the global economic system, and that the Washington consensus that we had been so used to listening to and belonging to was suddenly vulnerable. And secondarily, he, as a leader, and I really encourage you to read Elizabeth Economy's book. If you're not familiar with her, she's a colleague of mine now, a Greek American also, a colleague of mine at the Hoover Institution who is the Council on Foreign Relations. She's written a fantastic book about Xi Jinping personally. But suddenly you enter into a leadership challenge where he's consolidating power and making sure that there are no term limits to the leadership of the power in China. Same thing in Moscow. You have Vladimir Putin, who has a vision of his own person and of the relationship and the role of Russia and trying to both, in his mind, be a restorative leader, one that restores the greatness of the former Soviet Union, but of Russia in general. And then you've got Donald Trump, who always has seen himself as someone who is a singular deal maker, that everything else gets in the way of him just being able to get in there and make a deal. So while there are constraints through our structural understanding of the global order, there are opportunities through either manufactured or, in this case, growing and threatening crises, pandemic, financial crisis, you name it, and depending on the individual and their proclivities, will leverage those weaknesses, those structural weaknesses, to then apply their perception of their greatness and their role, and do it in a very assertive way. In the United States, through executive order, for example, to do an end run on institutional guardrails.
Ari, please jump in.
Well, now I've been challenged by my mentor, so I have to give very briefly a threefold answer and try to get out of this, let's say, problem here. And I'd say, well, structures don't make decisions, people do. And although Professor Platias is absolutely correct to say that going back it's been observed that structures do create tremendous pressures for actors to decide a certain way, I think that any systemic or structural theory does allow for mistakes to be made and cautions that you're going to pay the price. So that is not, it's not a completely deterministic theory. It does allow, and it does warn against not heeding the calls and pressures of structures. And I have to agree with Marco about a crisis. When a crisis takes place at that particular moment, a human agency, I think, is even more important, especially because you don't have necessarily perfect information, you're pressured, and you need to make decisions. Now, there's something that I'd like to just move to your graph clear conversation a bit. Here in Greece, we pay, correctly so, a lot of attention to the European Union, Turkey, the East Med, the Balkans, our region. But there's more to the world. Marco Kounalakis has been writing and has been thinking about another part that deals with the most populous countries in the world, China and India, and Pakistan as well. One country is predominantly Hindu and Muslim. The other is Sunni and Shia Muslim, and China is what? Confucian, nationalist, communist, something like that. And in one of your recent articles, I detected that you were hinting on Walsh's theory about let's proliferate nuclear weapons, and that will actually make states be more secure. We were just before he passed away, he came to our department and he gave a lecture. And we had 250 students there, and it's on YouTube, and it was a complete delight. But you did reference his theory. I assume it was him. You didn't mention him by name.
Yes.
And you do pay attention to a part of the world that is just incredibly important, but a little bit off our radar screens here in Greece, but not our department and not here in our webinar. So would you mind, for the benefit of our students and us also, talk a little bit about that part of the world and also how that might be affected by what happens in the White House?
Right. So all three nations that you mentioned are nuclear powers. And I think that we are ill-served if we fail to recognize the politics, domestic and otherwise, of nuclear power. Pakistan, India, and China are all in possession of nuclear weaponry, as is North Korea. And so we need to recognize that politics changes when and there are multiple theories about how politics change, but the way that we deal with nations when they have nuclear weaponry is very different. It's part of the reason why North Korea feels secure and the regime feels secure, is that they in fact are in possession of nuclear weapons. It's part of the reason that Pakistan, next door to a massive India, feels at least secure from invasion and the like, because they have a retaliatory force which is a deterrent to India. When I just prior at the end of the Bill Clinton administration, I was in the White House for an event, and I was in a sitting next to the National Security Advisor at the time, who was likely going to play a fairly important role in a Gore administration, which never came to be. And we were talking about any number of things, but he personally felt that Pakistan, India was the most important flashpoint and potential flashpoint in the world, and that they were paying an enormous amount of attention to this because of the rising tensions between those two nations, in particular over the regions, the disputed regions of Kashmir and Jammu. And those remain disputed regions. We see on a regular basis, whether it be Hindu nationalists or others, who are creating and exacerbating the tensions in that region, and in countries that are needing to respond to their national calls and their domestic politics for in India, a Hindu nationalism, and in Pakistan, in many ways feeling a little more threatened to maintain domestic support for the relatively new administration, and at the same time, we're also seeing a traditional alignment that is coming into play. Those of you who follow the news closely recognize that there was um, a border skirmish that left 20 Indian troops dead along the line of control between India and China, a disputed region again. So China and India have a tradition of having these challenging border questions, but but traditionally also, and I mean in modern times, um, China and Pakistan have ever had a very, very strong relationship. And so suddenly you've got an India that's feeling the pressure from two of those regional players. There may also have been some maritime activity recently by China in the Indian Sea that has raised the attention of some of the national security players in India. And so suddenly what you're finding, as I mentioned, I think earlier, is a greater alignment with the concerns of the other Indo-Pacific region countries, Japan, Australia, uh, India, and the United States, which sees itself as much of a Pacific nation as it does an Atlantic nation. And for good reason. We have not just Hawaii, but a whole west coast of our United States, and potentially the next vice president of the United States comes from California. So, and again, with populations that are Indo-American, who have, in the same way that Greek Americans, an interest in Greece and the relationship between the United States and Greece, have an interest in what happens in New Delhi and Washington. So you're seeing some of these alignments starting to firm up, and some of the national security concerns rise in the attention, at least of the leadership of these nations, if not necessarily at the popular level, because it's so difficult to translate these at the popular political level in ways other than in mass sort of political terms.
Thank you,
I hope
Marco.
that I hope that helped a little bit there in terms of talking about those regional
For
challenges.
sure. And I would like, being conscious of the time, I would like to bring us closer to our part of the world in Europe, and ask you about relations with Russia in a Biden administration. I understand there is a working group with the U.S. starting and the European Union on China, and the understanding of the potential threat of China and the need to counter it together is there even with the Trump administration. What about Russia, though? I understand that Europe has a different approach to Russia on some of the issues. Just to mention an example, the Nord Stream 2 controversy with the U.S. and between the U.S. and Germany. Where do you see a Biden administration standing on Russia? Do you think it will be harder on it, and in which way, sanctions or not? Or working with its European allies? And would you see any interest in more broadly in interventions on the part of the Biden administration, of interventionism, not necessarily in Europe, but obviously in the Middle East, for example? I'm just putting two questions together here so that we save some time.
Yeah, sure. And I mean, it's a good question. There's been a really odd relationship between President Trump and Putin, to the degree that there's nothing that Putin does that can be critical, that he will criticize, in part because I think there's this understanding that being nice to another leader will lead to some level of understanding and ability to get things done. I don't know what those things are that he was hoping to achieve, but it doesn't seem that there's been much movement on Ukraine, on the Crimea, on Belarus, on the threat to the Baltic states, Azeri crisis in Syria. None of these things where Russia has incrementally engaged itself, times dramatically, but most recently incrementally engaged itself. There's been no pushback from the United States other than congressional actions to force the administration towards sanctions. But we're almost at the point of maximal pressure. What else can the United States do? Certainly independently, but I think so. But the question was, what does it look like if we change to a Biden-Harris administration? But I think there's an interim step again, which is the period between November 3rd and January 20th, which again may be a moment of opportunity, in particular as Vladimir Putin and Lukashenko, who have not have a great personal relationship, but they have an accommodation that's been quite successful, where Belarusia is where Lukashenko is tired of these weekend demonstrations in Minsk, and calls on Big Brother to come and help with his leadership challenges. That's a potential. What I think would happen in a Biden administration is not so much an interventionist rise in potential interventionism. I don't see that. What I see, however, is a greater engagement with partners, and in much more second track type of activity, diplomatic activity, at a realist level. None of this sort of belief that if I go to beauty contests and shake hands with the leader of another country, that will make a difference in the way that he pursues his national interests. Instead, I think there's a recognition that Russia has national interests, that Putin has natural inclinations, and the United States and its allies have the same, and that we agree on those things that we can agree on. And I hope that renewal of the START agreement is one of them. Arms reductions is one of them. Terrorism is another one. Soon we have to agree, because we're both Arctic nations, on what happens in an Arctic that is becoming suddenly more accessible to trade and traffic, sea traffic, that is suddenly accessible to mineral and natural resource exploitation. These are areas where we can find common ground, and where I think a sort of a realist Biden, who has experience with Putin and who has experience with Russia, personal experience, will pursue those areas of agreement and of intersection, while being prepared to confront him on those reprehensible acts, like invading and occupying another nation.
Professor Pletias?
Oh, well, time is running up, so I will try to round two questions, and that will be my last take. Returning to a structural explanation of what's going on in the area, a lot of us explain the instability in Eastern Mediterranean and the broader Middle East from the change from the American hegemony that put hegemonic order to retrenchment of the United States that left a power vacuum. And this power vacuum, a lot of local actors like Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Egypt tried to fill. And this has created an instability which has produced all kinds of conflicts that we see in our area and a lot of failed states. The basic question is to Marco whether he feels that the Biden administration will re-engage in this area. The second question has to do with the fact that he's sitting in the Silicon Valley in Palo Alto, the heart of the Silicon Valley, and which is the innovation center of the world. And my question is, what's the feeling about the technology range with China? Is Silicon Valley afraid that China in the coming years will overcome technologically the United States?
Okay, so two questions with our limited amount of time, and I will address them. So one is the regional, will a Biden administration look at potential assertive re-engagement, potentially with the military? And I would say no, that's less likely to occur, in part because the domestic challenges are so great in this post-global pandemic era, and because resources are going to be so strained, whether it be with the development of a vaccine and distribution of a vaccine, trying to achieve some of the social welfare programs, whether they be health programs and the like, trying to shore up some of the challenges to American industry that occur. There's going to be, and also trying to bridge the deep divide, the deep social, cultural, and political divide that exists now in the United States. That's going to be a full-time 4-year job for the president, and so much so that I think that Biden will be unable to look at things in a much more assertive, aggressive way, as we have in the past when we've had more unipolar power in the world. But on the other hand, I would add one caveat here. The one thing that I think you will see in a Biden administration that's very different from what happened during Trump, during all nearly 4 years, will be a rebuilding of the State Department, of our diplomatic force, a less of a reliance on our defense structures as a conduit for our foreign policy, and a greater reliance on our diplomatic corps, and a rebuilding of what has effectively been a decimated esprit de corps, but also a corps that has been disempowered over the last 4 years because of the way that foreign policy has been conducted, either strictly out of the Oval Office, but at the most out of the Secretary of State's engagement with the White House, but really towing the line quite firmly. So no. On the second question on innovation and the technological challenge from China, it is very real. It is very real on multiple fronts, and I'd say that it's probably one of the greatest challenges to the United States currently, because of the focus that Xi Jinping has made on it, and the Party Congress has made on making sure that it can dominate in a number of fields. Just to mention two of those fields currently, one is artificial intelligence, AI, and the other is quantum computing. The number of resources that are being thrown at trying to get dominance in this area is very can be paralleled to the way that you saw their dominance in the 5G communications field. That is being challenged a little bit late. Potentially, the United States and others can put a halt to the types of dominance that Huawei has developed, both technologically but also in terms of its distributional structures. So we should not, no one should underplay the challenge to the United States and to Western nations on the technological innovation front. It is real, it is present, and it is something that everyone here is aware of, certainly in the Silicon Valley. Not so much on the industrial side, because they tend to be more globalist in their approaches rather than focusing on what is important for national security. But there's a growing awareness that even within some of these industries, whether they be social media or otherwise, that there has to be an alignment with national security strategy to some degree, because it actually could protect their intellectual property and their future earnings and profitability as China tries to dominate these other incipient and growing industries.
Thank you. And I believe you have the opportunity for one last question.
Right. And of course, you will have the opportunity to do the concluding remarks and the summary. But I would like to conclude by quoting one of my favorite political philosophers. He never actually went to high school. All he did was formal education stopped at 5th grade. But I'm referring, of course, to Yogi Berra, the New York Yankees catcher. And in one of his astute and brilliant pronouncements, I mean, they're all astute and brilliant, he opined that it's hard to make predictions, especially about the future. So let's make it very hard for Marco Kounalakis, and I'm going to ask for 2 predictions. where does the next crisis come from? What part of the world? And who's going to win the election a week from today?
Okay, and who wins the election? Is that the second question? Okay, well, first of all, Yogi Berra is more of a philosopher than anything, right? And understand someone who understands human nature quite deeply. So, where's the next flashpoint? And it might be unpredictable. I think that we really need to look at, and I'm not saying this because of a Greek audience. I think what's going on in Ankara, where Erdogan looks next. I think he may be spreading himself a little thinly right now, but he has domestic concerns that could drive his foreign policy to a great degree. And I'm not sure where that would be, whether it would be east or west, but he seems to really look for those moments of opportunity, such as this one. The only other place might be, again, a moment of opportunity in Belarus during this period. As for who wins, depends on if you catch me morning, noon, or night. I certainly would like to believe the polls, but anyone who lived through 2016 knows that those are fraught. But since Kamala Harris is a good friend, and since Joe Biden is someone who my wife has really supported dramatically, and with a number of fundraisers and going on the stump and stepping in for him as a surrogate at times, I have to go with Biden-Harris. And I hope it's an overwhelming victory. I hope they win Florida. I write for the Miami Herald, and so I am hoping that Florida flips. If Florida goes for Biden-Harris, then the election is done early in the evening, and I think the contestation is over with. Should Florida not go, we may be in for a wild ride between November 3rd and January 20th. You want me to do any concluding remarks? I think that's kind of a good way to end it. So
I think that's a great way to end it, yeah. Marco, and we can get back to it. Right, while the tsunami is coming behind you.
That's right.
Well, I thank you so much for your time. I will not even attempt to summarize this discussion, but one of my takeaways, other than the really high stakes of these elections, and to watch, to see how they go, to have results as soon and as with as little of contest as possible is critical both for the US and for the rest of the world. And with that, I would like to thank, on behalf of the University of Piraeus, you as our honored speaker, but also Professors Athanasios Platias and Professor Aristotle Tsiabidis for their very insightful questions, both on current affairs and on theory, and also our audience, of course. Thank you all so very much, and we'll all be watching what happens in Washington, D.C. next week.
Thank you, Katerina, and I hope the next time that we will meet in class and not over the internet, the pandemic permitting.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.